On July 10, 1832, President Andrew Jackson delivered a stern message to Congress. He would veto the Second Bank of the United States. He would veto its renewal. Jackson declared in his veto message, quote, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes." Exclusive privileges like the charter of the Second Bank widened the chasm between the rich and, quote, "the humble members of society, the farmers, the mechanics, and laborers." And to Jackson and Jackson's supporters, no individual exemplified rich and powerful men bending government to their selfish whims, like the Second Bank's third president, a man from Pennsylvania named Nicholas Biddle. In part one of our series on populism and populist myths, I talked about the myth of the people, a great imaginary mass of selfless, hard-working individuals, often invoked by populist politicians to stir their followers to ever greater levels of support. And nothing enhances this particular trope like the addition of a nice, juicy, populist bad guy. Somebody who could be represented as part of the elite, the privileged class, the selfish, the uncaring and unlistening, the greedy, endlessly preying upon the needy. Biddle was one of the first populist bad guys in American history, and it should be said, to be fair, that he played the part. He unwittingly played into Andrew Jackson's portrayal of him as a populist foil. But in the end, I think that history will remember Biddle and his bank, which came to be contemptuously derided as Biddle's Bank, as a force for good, for accountability, and for public financial stability. And the bank's removal will be remembered as a blunder that led to the Panic of 1837 and the Depression of the early 1840s. After the smoke subsided following the War of 1812, President James Madison submitted to Congress something like a blueprint that various leaders started calling the American system. The system had three parts. First, a tariff on imported manufactured goods to protect American industry. This became the Tariff of 1816, which especially protected cheap cotton textiles, the cotton goods like shirts and dresses produced in the factories of New England. Second, federal financing of improved roads and canals. This, while proposed, never really got off the ground because Madison didn't think he had the constitutional authority to do it. And third, a new national bank to replace the old Bank of the United States, whose charter had expired in 1811. This was called the Second Bank of the United States. It functioned as the financial agent of the government. It collected taxes, paid the government's debts and expenses. The Second Bank also had the power to inspect local banks to make sure that the paper money that they issued was actually worth something. Remember, back then, while the Second Bank could issue currency notes, it wasn't the official currency of the USA. Local banks could also issue currency by claiming that they had sufficient gold and silver in their vaults. They could accept deposits from customers and give them paper money to use elsewhere on the assumption that they could redeem the paper money from the bank for specie, as gold and silver were called. The Second Bank had the power to check these claims. It could do this because, as the bank of the government, it accumulated a lot of money issued by local banks, which depositors used to pay taxes. So the Second Bank could go to a local bank and demand payment in gold and silver in exchange for that bank's paper money. And it could shut down banks that couldn't comply with these requests. Now, when the bank started, it didn't do a lot of this oversight stuff. In fact, the bank pretty much ignored a huge speculative frenzy that blew up following the War of 1812. Trade resumed with Europe, and demand for American products in Europe skyrocketed, especially for cotton and grain. And banks started loaning farmers money by basically just printing money regardless of how much specie they actually had. But when European demand for American farm products calmed down, the economic bubble popped. Many of the local bank loans were short-term, and bankers began to demand that farmers pay back their loans. Some banks had borrowed money from the Bank of the USA, and the Bank of the USA asked for it back. And the next thing you knew, the Panic of 1819 was happening. Bankruptcies and farmers going to debtor's prison, that kind of thing. Across the country, farmers blamed the Bank of the United States for the recession. The legitimacy of the bank even wound up in the docket of the Supreme Court, and in the case of Moloch versus Maryland in 1819, Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the bank was a proper and constitutional exercise of constitutional authority. Anyway, the panic subsided and people grumbled about the bank, but it still had its charter and its constitutional legitimacy. But when Andrew Jackson became president, he very quickly renewed his hostility to banks. The question is why? The answer, as I'll explain in the next part of this series on populism, has a lot to do with Creek and Cherokee Indians.